So today in VRED we're going to have a look at how to get our camera rotating around specific points when we're doing animations. So like a nice turntable effect, similar to how it works when we just are moving the camera around freely when we're working. We found that in our sort of class tutorials where we're having a look at it, simply using curves and keying in the position of the camera. So when we set perspective and keying in the position in one point and then another tended to create a really sharp transition between one point and the other. So obviously we don't want that. We want to be able to pivot around smoothly. So this is that Porsche model I showed off in class the other week. Doesn't really matter what you use, although for this case I think it works because it gives us a lot of different things we can look at. So having a look at all the settings we have in camera, there's one option which, we've got our standard fields of view, viewing, all this kind of stuff. These change when you move the camera around, and obviously you can set it up to be whatever kind of camera you want. We want to come down to animation, and this one down here called get from view. So what this is going to do is, depending on where we have our pivot point set, so example of that is if I hold in control and right click on this headlight, we're going to pivot around this headlight. By getting the pivot point from view, what that's going to allow us to do is to change our distance, height and angle based on this point, and we can plug this directly into our curves or even the animation from here as well, but I prefer to do it through curves. So let's go for something like this center cap, nice in the center of the bonnet. It'll give us a cool way to sort of pivot around here. So what we can simply do is click get from view. What that does is now allows us to play with the angle, and that's going to allow us to rotate the angle like that. We can change the distance if we want to zoom in. It does a really cool sort of crash zoom in effect as well, depending on the height, and then the height as well, it'll rotate it down. So we can play around with some of these settings in really interesting ways. And that should allow us to get those cool sort of rotations and camera movements. So what we can do now is, if we open up our curves, and so this is going to block out most of the actual screen, we can come down from perspective to what's called turntable distance, turntable height and turntable angle. So now that relates to these options we have here. So what we can do is, we'll come back to where we want to start, and I'll just move this down out of the way here. So something like that, we can re-click get from view just so it updates on where we've moved the camera manually. And we can select these three and key the selected channels. So let's just see if we can select those and frame them. They're all over the place because they have quite different values. The values are, 1700 to 275 and 217. So that doesn't really matter how they don't really relate to each other. What we have to do now though is open our timeline. A good thing to do is to change the max timeline up to 100 and 100 on the preview. So this is just so we can preview 100 frames. And generally we want to just put our time frame at 25 FPS and change our playback to 25 FPS. So that just means for every 1 second of footage, it's going to be 25 frames. So what we can do now is move over to our 100th frame, and we can play around with these. So, simply by moving the angle, we can come across to here, and then we just want to select our angle. If we zoom out enough, we'll see that we are on the 100th frame, and when we key that, that should have updated. So now we're going from a value of, what are we at, 217 to 350. So if we roll our timeline back and forwards, we can see that it's just doing that simple rotation. So we can also come to the end of it and adjust the height and play around with the distance or whatever we might want to do. So we can even zoom way out. You can still change the actual angle itself. All you have to do is then re-update these. So even if you're just doing something basic, you can select them all, key them all, and then when we roll back, it does a nice, really smooth sort of transition between them. When you hit play, it'll come out really smooth when you render out that animation. So yeah, that's one way that we can use this turntable feature, which is under, if we open our camera, we come down to animation and get from view. So again, it's really important to make sure we control and right click to set our view. Now, because I've done that, I don't know. Okay, so it is just going to reset to where it was in that start position. So if you do want to do more than one animation, you can play around with starting to export these as animation blocks, as we do down here, but I think we'll get into that a bit later on, because right now we're not trying to build super complex scenes, we're just trying to get specific elements going. So let's say we've done that. I also want to show off how we can go about changing the background of our scene for one, and changing the environment, and how to actually make it look like our car, or in this case a droid, or if it's a piece of furniture, whatever it may be, actually sit in our environment properly. So the problem you get with 3D environments like this, which is mapped onto a sphere, onto a dome in this case, you can see where it starts to roll up around the edges, and it does look a bit weird. So it's not ideal for renders. So just firstly, we can have a change of scenery by going to our asset manager, going over to our environments, and we get all these example environments. The basic one is just the studio, and this changes how the lighting works on our object, urban architecture, whatever you want really. There's quite a few good ones. Some tend to work a lot better with other materials, so this kind of is coming out looking a bit dull. And of course the ground shading's gone because we've changed the environment around it. I think we've all done this in maybe Keyshot or Fusion if we've looked at changing scenery. What I did want to show off is that we can actually go online and find some good resources as well. So I think my favorite place online to find backgrounds and environments is called HDR Haven. It's sort of like a crowd-funded, sourced way of going about providing HDR environments, and this is what we're talking about, a HDR, so like a full HD environment that surrounds your object in light in that kind of sphere or ball. So we can find one. Let's go for something, there's heaps to choose from, and we'll find, let's see if we get lucky when we pick one. We'll find that when we look at them, some of them have okay, so this one actually has some issues with it, but we can go into them, and some actually have backplates included. So like this one, and this is going to allow us to render our object in this sort of scene. So maybe we'll go with this one. It looks quite interesting. And what I'll do is we'll download this as a backplate, and that's going to be 20 meg. That's a pretty big backplate. That's fine. And we also want to download the environment. So as you can see, it's got this sort of 360 view lens going on. What we want to do is download it. We'll go 4K. You can get super huge resolutions going on, but 4K is heaps for now. So I'll just hit download on that, and that's going to take a second. If we open up this, we can see it's quite a nice looking backplate. So we then come across to VRED, and what we want to do is come across to our scene plate editor, that's going to allow us to create a scene plate. So scene plate, we can see up the top here, we have front plates and we have back plates. Front plates are if you want to overlay anything in front of your render. So like you can overlay your logo or signature in the corner, and that'll show up on every single render you do, or a back plate, which obviously works as a background. So if we create a back plate, so we've inserted our back plate, we turn on our scene plates, and we've got our back plate showing here. Now, the problem with this is our car's kind of floating, or our droid or whatever. You can also use this with actual images you take. So we can show and hide it there, and having transform on doesn't really sort of achieve much because it just moves the back plate around it. So if we use the middle mouse button, we can pan our car in the scene and play around with it. The problem is we want to try and match our perspective. There are a few ways we can do this. One is just kind of by playing around with the camera. So adjusting the focal length as we try and position it to see if we can get something to look right. This generally isn't the right way to do it. And what we want to do is play around with our perspective match option. So when we turn this on, this gives us what's called vanishing lines, and this might be somewhat familiar if you've actually looked at like sketching in 2D perspective or three-point perspective. So what we want to do is turn on this perspective match and hold in shift and select these points. So now we get the option to drag and align these points. Don't worry about the actual car model freaking out. And it wants us to line it up with parts of the environment. So let me just move that out of the way. What we can do here is we can grab this red and try and match it up with these lines that are traveling in this direction. So just kind of try and focus on the actual zoomed in area when you select it. So we might even bring this one down in here. And I'm just trying to follow along the path of these bricks. Depending on the environment you select, you might have an easier or harder time trying to do this. But we can come across there. Same for down here. These ones seem easy enough to see. And you just kind of got to use your judgment. Sometimes you'll start to know how to tweak it around in bits and pieces. I'm not quite sure if these buildings are straight or not, but we can just kind of hope that they might be, or you can pretty much just go just about vertical anyway. It's not really a big deal with the back one as much. It does like to freak out a bit as well. But now we can see that we can no longer rotate the vehicle up and down. It's only allowing us to sort of turn it, zoom in and out, and position it. So understanding scale is kind of important here now, because we should know how big the car is relative to, say, like a bike in the background over there. So if we position it like that, it starts to look a bit big, but maybe that's starting to look a bit more realistic. The problem is now that turn that back on. The problem is that our lighting is, well, it doesn't match the scene at all. So what we have to do then is insert our HDR environment that we downloaded. So we can come across to materials, and what we want to do is create an environment. Generally we want to go with the sphere. That's how most 3D environments are captured. And we find our environment that we downloaded, we open that. That takes a second, and now we can see that it's putting on the lighting as though it was in this environment. If we turn off our scene plate, we can see where it's all sitting. So, you know, the environment itself is a little, like the positioning's a little off. So sometimes you got to play around with the X and Y and all those kind of things. You can get it from the object if you have your car selected and get from object and play around with some of these settings. It is kind of really difficult to get the environment size matched up to the actual object. So if we look around, it does like to sort of go through the ground a bit. You can play around with transforming the environment a bit, but so something like that might actually give it a bit more even shading. Once we've got that, we can then just turn on the scene plate again. We might find we want to rotate the car and bring it, you know, to the center of our view. Maybe there. It's kind of hard to tell. We also really need to get this shadow going on the ground. So when we come across to our environment, we want to open it up and see that we've got our shadow plane here. If we turn on boundings, we can see it is kind of there. I'm just going to turn the scene plate off. Okay, so because I actually moved the environment, the shadow plane is way too far down. It should be, well, just under our vehicle. So what we need to do is transform that till it's at the point of the vehicle. So just so I can have a look, I'm going to go to the front plane and just drag that down. So that's looking pretty good right about there. And that should be fine. We'll go back to our perspective camera and we've got that view perspective still on. We turn on our scene plate. Whatever, the vehicle can be fine there. Generally you want to do this where you actually have a really good sense of scale. So for example, if you were able to get a actual image that has things you can reference better, so things like stairs are usually a certain height, sewer grates, that kind of thing. You know, it's kind of hard to tell exactly how big these bricks might be, or you know, the height of that. You can kind of match some things up, but this kind of works for now. What we then have to do is select our shadow plane itself, and we want to bake some lighting onto it. So bake lighting and shadows, and we try and bring that across. Ambient occlusion, and we just calculate it, and we can see that's put a bit of shadow under the car now, so it looks like it's sitting in that environment a bit better. So that's how we can go about sort of setting up a object in a scene with somewhat correct lighting. All the lighting looks quite convincing. We can still play around with it a bit more. So if you actually open it up, we can play around with the rotation of it. Not in that way, that's going around it. We might want to be in the Z. Yeah, so this is like rotating it across the face of it. Yeah, so that should probably be at 0, but these ones you can play around with. You can, because it's a HDR environment, you can play around with the exposure, tone it down slightly, tone it up. It might actually look better with a proper color on the car instead of just a white, but you know, these kind of things, it really just kind of takes a lot of practice, and when you've got a lot of time to actually suit it towards the vehicle or the environment, or you know, whatever you're making specifically, you can really play around with these to get the exact look you're looking for, and try and get it into the scene. Obviously you can then turn on ray tracing, which is going to take it to that next level when it's calculating the light, projecting on it from all surfaces. So like something like that, it's starting to look a little more real. If I turn that shadow plane back on, that's going to help as well. So now it looks like it's baking that car onto the scene. How do I turn off that preview? Nope, doesn't matter. We can just turn off perspective match there because it's already in position. And so if we were to sit there and let that run out and calculate properly, or if we, actually set up a render, that would be a relatively convincing render if you wanted to show off what a vehicle would look like in this scene. So for your own sort of work, it can be a picture of a desk, or if it's going to be assisting people with their guide dogs or something like that. You go out on the street and you take a picture out on the street, or you find one of like Melbourne City, and then you can use like a generic city HD environment that'll allow you to get very similar lighting to the actual image you're using. So I think with those two main sort of tips, which are the environment and the turntable, we can get some really good looking renders going. I think next what we'll go into is adding in sort of movement into still renders, so talking about motion blur and stuff, but we can have a look at that next time. Thanks.